Fascists are fetishists. Entire books could be devoted to fascism or the reactionary mind, and I won't fully explain these things here. The term reactionary comes out of the French Revolution and refers to attacks on liberalism from the right. Reactionary mindsets are perpetually cultivated by the bourgeoisie. This is typically known as right-wing populism, e.g., racism, sexism, xenophobia, sectarianism, superstition, conspiracy theorizing, etc. It is cruel, vengeful, and violently obsessed with taking something back, or defending something. Even, or perhaps especially, when these things never existed, or were obviously stolen, or aren't under threat at all. Right-wing populism is instrumentalized to consolidate previously diffuse power and to justify the perpetuance of verticalized class societies, especially those based on birth circumstance. Essentially, this is hegemonic maintenance. The final stage of these tactics is known as fascism. We'll take a look at how and why these tactics were used historically before getting into an exploration of how reactionaries and fascists think in terms of fetishism, and obsess over these fetishes to the point of functionally replacing reality with them. An early view of fascism. I will quote at length from Clara Zetkin's The Struggle Against Fascism, which she delivered to the Communist International in 1923. Much has been written since the rise and fall of fascism, but I think an early and contemporaneous analysis will be illuminating. Fascism is a specific means of achieving a highly authoritarian form of capitalism. It is recognizable more as a process than an outcome. This confuses many people, as liberal empires have carried out mass terror, genocides, colonialism, for-profit wars, mass incarceration, and every other horror. Feudal empires were similar, of course, but socialist countries have also engaged in collective punishments of entire ethnicities and mass incarceration. It will help to discuss what fascism is not. First of all, fascism is not merely class terror inflicted top-down by a revanchist ruling class, as had recently at the time occurred in Hungary. Quote, "The terror in Hungary began after the defeat of an initially victorious revolutionary struggle. For a moment, the bourgeoisie trembled before the proletariat's might. The Horthy terror emerged as revenge against the revolution. The agent of this revenge was a small caste of feudal officers." End quote. Nor is fascism the same as Bonapartism, which is more of an anti-feudal phenomenon. With Bonapartism, some kind of new or provisional government is established by a multi-class revolutionary struggle. As capitalists, small capitalists, peasantry, and workers struggle in the wake of the defeat of the feudal lords, the new state flexes its power. The upper classes band together to crush the working class. The royalists and the Republican industrialists crush the petty bourgeois Democrats. The royalists stab the Republicans in the back. It all peels apart layer upon social layer like a stupid onion, leaving nothing but the strong man at the center. Quote, "A government which raises itself above the nation is not, however, suspended in air. The true axis of the present government passes through the police, the bureaucracy, the military clique. It is a military police dictatorship with which we are confronted, barely concealed with the decorations of parliamentarism. But a government of the saber as the judge-arbiter of the nation. That's just what Bonapartism is. The saber by itself has no independent program. It is the instrument of order. It is summoned to safeguard what exists. Raising itself politically above the classes, Bonapartism, like its predecessor, Caesarism, for that matter, represents in the social sense, always and at all epochs, the government of the strongest and firmest part of the exploiters." Leon Trotsky. Here, it is the state apparatus itself that crushes the left, not a bunch of street thugs. Once the left is ruined, the head of state merely cements his rule, and nothing remains to stop him. Back to Zetkin on fascism. Quote, "The base of fascism lies not in a small caste, but in broad social layers, broad masses, reaching even into the proletariat." End quote. Clearly, military means alone cannot destroy fascism, something which Zetkin predicted and which history has proven. As such, it is necessary to vanquish fascism politically and economically as well. Reformists typically conceptualize fascism as merely terror unleashed on the lower classes by the upper classes, and it was common at the time for such reformers to argue from a position of horseshoe theory. Quote, "Thus, fascism, for the reformists, is the consequence of the Russian Revolution, the proletariat's original sin in the Garden of Eden." End quote. Therefore, these enlightened centrists argue, we must confront fascism non-violently. Quote, What lies behind this entire conception of nonviolence? It is the reformists' faith in the unshakable strength of the capitalist order and bourgeois class rule, along with distrust and cowardice toward the proletariat as a conscious and irresistible force of world revolution. End quote. Just a reminder that this woman was writing in 1923, nearly a decade before the SPD's tactics of consolidating with rightist forces to crush the left resulted in the ascendancy of the Nazi Party. Capitalists and feudal lords before them committed atrocities on a global scale purely for power and profit. No left-wing uprising, bloody or otherwise, was necessary to convince the bourgeoisie into the transatlantic slave trade, the genocide of indigenous peoples all over the world, or the colonization of most of the planet. Further, this simple conception of fascism doesn't answer the question of why these specific tactics of black shirts, extra-legal terror, and assassinations were used how and when they were. Why couldn't the Italian ruling class of industrialists and the southern agrarian lords just use the same state terror as Bonaparte? Quote, specifically, we view fascism as an expression of the decay and disintegration of the capitalist economy and as a symptom of the bourgeois state's dissolution. We can combat fascism only if we grasp that it rouses and sweeps along broad social masses who have lost the earlier security of their existence and with it, often, their belief in social order. Fascism is rooted, indeed, in the dissolution of the capitalist economy and the bourgeois state. There were already symptoms of the proletarianization of bourgeois layers in pre-war capitalism. The war shattered the capitalist economy down to its foundations. This is evident not only in the appalling impoverishment of the proletariat, but also in the proletarianization of very broad petty bourgeois and middle bourgeois masses, the calamitous conditions among small peasants, and the bleak distress of the intelligentsia. The plight of the intellectuals is all the more severe given that pre-war capitalism took measures to produce them in excess of demand. The capitalists wanted to extend the mass supply of labor power to the field of intellectual labor, and thus unleash unbridled competition that would depress wages. Salaries. It was from these circles that imperialism recruited many of its ideological champions for the World War. At present, all these layers are experiencing the collapse of the hopes they had placed in the war. Their conditions have become significantly worse. What weighs on them, above all, is the lack of security for their basic existence, which they still had before the war. End quote. But fascism isn't just the result of a crisis of capitalism. If that were the case, fascism would abound constantly. Quote, fascism has another source. It is the blockage, the halting pace of world revolution resulting from betrayal by the reformist leaders of the workers' movement. Among a large part of the middle layers, the civil servants, bourgeois intellectuals, and the small and middle bourgeois, who were proletarianized or were threatened with that fate, the psychology of war was replaced by a degree of sympathy for reformist socialism. End quote. The civil alternative must be seen as a failure. Reformist socialism must be off the table. What came, historically, of a reformist socialism that involved collaborating with the ruling class? Many ended up disillusioned. Quote, these layers lacked in general any theoretical, historical, or political education. Their sympathy for reform socialism was not deeply rooted. So, as things turned out, they lost their belief not only in the reformist leaders but also in socialism itself. The socialists promised an easing of our burdens and suffering, plus many beautiful things, and a reshaping of society on the foundations of justice and democracy, they said. But the top dogs and the rich carry on and rule with even more severity than before. End quote. The failures of these so-called social democracies are perceived not merely as a rebuke to reforming capitalism, but as an invalidation of socialism itself. Quote, masses in their thousands streamed to fascism. It became an asylum for all the politically homeless, the socially uprooted, the destitute, and the disillusioned. And what they no longer hoped for from the revolutionary proletarian class and from socialism, they now hoped would be achieved by the most able, strong, determined, and bold elements of every social class. All these forces must come together in a community, and this community, for the fascists, is the nation. End quote. This phenomenon feeds into itself as the political economy decays even further. Quote, tormented by the scorpions of an upsurge in poverty, even the proletarian with the thickest skin finally begins to rebel against capitalism. But the means of force available to the bourgeois state are beginning, in part, to break down. The state is losing the financial strength and moral authority needed to maintain blind loyalty and subjugation among its slaves. For that, it needs an extra-legal and non-state instrument of force. That has been offered by the motley assemblage that makes up the fascist mob. That is why the bourgeoisie offers its hand for fascism's kiss, granting it complete freedom of action, contrary to all its written and unwritten laws. It goes further. It nourishes fascism, maintains it, and promotes its development with all the means at its disposal in terms of political power and hordes of money." End quote. Most liberals get caught up in the aesthetics of fascism, its uniforms, its conspiracies, its particular hatreds. It is fitting, then, that fascism is largely the destruction of anything resembling political discourse with spectacles and aesthetics. Don't get caught up in the symbols and slogans. Quote, "It is evident that fascism has different characteristics in every country, based on specific circumstances. Nonetheless, in every country it has two essential features: a sham revolutionary program, which links up in extremely clever fashion with the moods, interests, and demands of broad social masses, and the use of brutal violence and terror." End quote. I know that's brief, but consider reading the whole thing, especially the section Fascism's Rise in Italy. Fetishism and the Reactionary Mind. It isn't uncommon for people to superficially associate fascism with any political violence, but every political project is violent in some way. Liberals kill and subjugate workers and peasants in order to establish capital and extract profits. Socialists kill in order to dissolve these things. Socialists violently repress efforts to restore capitalism. Fascism is still about preserving class structures, capital accumulation, profitability, and the like. But that is not what animates the fascist mob. The kernel of fascist violence, I think, is most easily understood by looking at the murder of Elon Nettles. As she was walking home, a man hit on her. Upon finding out she was trans, he beat her to death. The murders of trans women, particularly trans women of color, are rather commonplace as hate crimes go, and are emblematic of the fascist impulse to destruction. Nettles didn't engage with this man. She didn't do anything to him. She didn't change him. He was always attracted to trans women. He had an image of himself, as many people do. That image was cisnormative. It was heteronormative. Being into trans women is construed as not being heteronormative. Elon Nettles didn't degrade him for that. His own friends did. Reactionaries in general degrade men for being attracted to trans women. Nettles didn't ask for these various social relations to be mediated through her. She didn't ask or demand anything of her killer, but in an effort to make these associated degradations go away, he killed her. This is what makes the fascist impulse so dangerous. This man could kill every trans woman and still feel this way, in the same way that the Nazis killed millions of Jewish people while still often enough believing that the same shadowy Jewish cabal was controlling everything. The Soviets were controlled by the Jews. The US was entering the war at the urging of international finance, which was controlled by the Jews. It's quite similar to the man who hates his job, so he goes home, gets drunk, and beats his wife. The reactionary doesn't want to be John Doe from Topeka, Kansas, who works as a marketing and sales associate at Staples and lives alone in a studio apartment. He wants to be a billionaire Viking ladies' man. Reactionaries view these media-cultivated controlling images as their natural state, and they blame others, trans people, Jewish people, women, socialists, etc., for having corrupted that natural state. Degeneracy, race mixing, cultural Marxism, and so on. Maybe there will always be people like this, but it becomes a social force because of political displacement. All the old, sophisticated ideologies have been discredited, so people refer to common sense, which has always been the cult of tradition, the reactionary mindset. All coherent frameworks are rejected as lies cooked up by the same nebulously defined elites who destroyed society to begin with. With no systemic critique to be had, all that remains is a morass of conspiracies orchestrated by cartoon villains. Now the Third World isn't poor due to centuries of colonialism and the economic nature of capital accumulation. It's because they are backwards, genetically inferior savages. They aren't being displaced by war, or by cultivated scarcity, or by climate disasters. They're invading the country. Are liberals going to correct this? Would it be possible to do that without exposing the idea of meritocracy as false? The problem is that liberalism, despite relying rather heavily on fantasy, is a coherent ideology, and any bit of propaganda liberals come up with needs to mesh with everything else. Fascism is a meme-plex. essentially a trash can where all the most antisocial, vengeful resentments in any society are sequestered. No fascist needs to be logically consistent. They only need to be narratively and emotionally consistent. Liberals have already inflicted all the worst aspects of capitalist society on minorities and allowed various chauvinisms to fester for their own profit. It's only too easy to scapegoat the most bombed, jailed, and impoverished people explicitly after so many decades of implicit degradation. The only form of extreme fetishism I have personal experience with is eating disorders. According to the Mayo Clinic, quote, anorexia isn't really about food. It's an extremely unhealthy and sometimes life-threatening way to cope with emotional problems. When you have anorexia, you often equate thinness with self-worth, end quote. The obsessive-compulsive characteristics, the distorted view of what is being fetishized, weight, race, sex, etc., it all lines up right down to the risk factors associated with media-cultivated aesthetics. To be clear, people with eating disorders are not dangerous, immoral, or necessarily right-wing. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is how fascists treat, say, Jewish people or black people. They have this image in their minds of some kind of successful, fulfilling society. Maybe it's totally utopian, maybe it's just rose-tinted nostalgia, and they latch onto this kind of aesthetic obsession. The good times in their minds had fewer successful Jewish people, or black people knew their place, or women were so much nicer and prettier. Restricting the rights of those people will bring the good times back. But they have no material conception of these political economic conditions. Their analysis isn't even remotely scientific or historical. When people say, "Make America great again," they usually aren't referring to rates of taxation, unionization, or bank regulation. They're referring to culture war issues. As minorities are terrorized more and more, they feel temporarily good that they're winning, but they never feel emotionally fulfilled. They never feel satisfied. What's actually alienating them is a political economic system in which they were only ever supposed to be human shields against the exploited masses. Within fascism, increasingly large amounts of the nation's capital, labor power, and natural resources are oriented toward war. Women are discouraged from the workforce. Minorities are killed off in large numbers or else flee. Political rights are terminated. Labor rights are terminated. The standard of living declines, the work week increases, and wages go down, which means that the Jews are still in power, and more must be done against them. The only terminal point of scapegoating is mass death. Islamic-branded fascist terror attacks kill about as many people in the US each year as dogs or champagne cork accidents. But is that going to stop people from freaking out about it? That's what capitalist media is talking about, and that's what gets to the fear center of the reactionary mind. Poverty deaths due to artificial scarcity are much more common, but who cares? There's nothing spectacular about that. Those sorts of deaths don't affect a middle-class suburb. What I'm saying is, the alt-right is Thinspo for bigots. I mean, not literally, but this does highlight the total uselessness of trying to compromise with reactionaries. There's no tangible outcome that will satisfy them, and any emotionally consistent narrative is as good as any other, which is why this awful book doesn't actually matter. Not really. If we discredit it, they'll just glom onto something else. See Hakim's latest history of racial pseudoscience. If people forget the bell curve has been discredited, it'll come back into relevance. We need to fix the underlying problem. The productive forces, the relations of production, and the buildup of unequal power and luxury that has so far resulted from them. This isn't merely an intellectual exercise, it's an organizational one. History is not made by political truth, but by political power. And that's all I have to say on that. Thank you for your consideration. So, that was way too long. In the future, I guess I'll try not to make videos about everything at the same time and try to just make one point instead of just coming back to the same material over and over again. I guess the too long didn't watch version would be that IQ doesn't really correlate socially that well with crime or teen pregnancy. Lead exposure does a better job of it, and so does a look at politics. The neoliberal era is an era of mass incarceration in this country and in every other. With regards to race and IQ, European versus African genetic admixture, there's no correlation there with IQ. IQ doesn't actually correlate that well with income. It doesn't correlate very well with job performance. The idea that capitalism is this super meritocratic thing and totally unworthy idiot children aren't inheriting vast wealth anymore or whatever, it's just sort of nonsense. That's still happening. The Trumps still exist. Meghan McCain is still on TV. 60% of all wealth is still inherited. A lot of these trust fund babies do go bankrupt pretty fast, but enough of them don't. They argue that immigration is dysgenic, but immigrants actually start businesses at higher rates than native-born citizens, and they commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. So they actually are like, quote-unquote, self-starting or whatever. Everybody is looking for some kind of political shortcut to having to go out and meet people and build up organizations and consciously try to get things done. It's completely possible to do that. Most of the good things that have happened in the last centuries have all been as a result of that. Just waiting around for some genius to come and fix all of your problems is defeatism. It's very similar to me to Jordan Peterson, actually, of the whole, just clean your room, improve yourself instead of doing politics. It's this idea that, well, you have high IQ, so just do your job, and that's your political stance. Just let the oligarchs handle it. In any case, I clearly have permanent laryngitis, and I cannot control my voice. And that's that.